Hi, English students. Thanks for joining me. Today, we are going to learn about some really cool and interesting history that's incredibly important for you to know before we can jump right into the novel Animal Farm. Now, today, we're going to break this history up into two parts. We're going to learn all about the reasons why people have revolutions. We're going to learn about some words that might be new to you, like totalitarianism and dictatorships. And then we're going to delve right into some great history. I am going to show you a couple of books, but I'm also going to play for you some Russian folk music. Give this a listen. This book, which I own, which is all about the Russian Revolution, has been with me for a long time. It taught me a lot about what people were thinking at the time, because there are actually personal letters in the book, and it's a book that you can use to teach students about the revolution and have them write letters themselves, see how they would feel. Here's another one. Read this in college. Marx for Beginners. Well, you probably don't know who Karl Marx is, but Marx was the father of an idealism, an ideology, an idea of thought that was all about collectively working together so we can do better. Okay, it was Marxism. So this is Marx for Beginners. And here's another one that I read in college. You guys know how much I love history. I have a degree in history. It's called Why Lenin? Why Stalin? And today, you've probably heard those names, at least I hope you have, Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, right? But I don't know if you know these people very well. So today we're going to learn about the history of them. Okay, I kind of sound like Chekhov from Star Trek, don't I? So with that, we'll just stop the Russian folk music and we'll go ahead and jump right in. Be sure to have your notes open so you can respond to some questions. The notes in Google Classroom are called Animal Farm and the Russian Revolution. So let's jump right in. The historical background that you need to know that connects us to the novel that we're going to read, which was written in 1945. The historical background is really important for you to understand all these political events, so you understand what George Orwell was satirizing. Now, what is satire? That is one of the terms on your notes. Satire is the use of humor or irony or even exaggeration to ridicule or expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics. So George Orwell is using satire to make fun of things that are human foibles, and that word means faults or problems. Now, without this knowledge that I'm going to impart, you might actually be mistaken into thinking that our novel is just some sad little story about animals. And kids could read this book and not really have to understand that it's an allegory, but the book is concerned with revolutions and why people revolt against their government. So it really has a much deeper meaning than the story about sad animals. Now, Animal Farm is going to make very specific parallels to the Russian Revolution, and that happened in 1917. Well, first there was a peasant revolt in 1905, but we'll get to that in a moment. So it's important for you to know what was happening in Russia before and why the people rose up against their leader. That's a picture of him, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Okay, so Animal Farm is what's called an allegory. Find that on your notes. It's an allegory about what went wrong in Tsarist Russia and how it evolved into communist Russia, but that was really no better. But what's an allegory? It's a narrative that uses some literary devices to unveil some hidden meanings, which we're going to get to. So, as you read in our book, you can think about the characters, which are different animals, whether they are pigs or dogs, horses, ducks, things like that, and what their real or human counterparts would be. And so we're going to see a comparison document on Google Classroom. And here are a couple of examples. One of the pigs, named Napoleon, is actually supposed to represent Joseph Stalin. And another one of the pigs, named Snowball, is actually supposed to be Trotsky. So these were people that were part of the Russian Revolution. Now, there are some other concrete things that are in the novel that represent actual historical things or events, like what you see on your screen here. There is a hoof and a horn on the animal's flag that they are going to invent in the novel. And it's supposed to represent like the hammer and the sickle on the real Russian flag, okay? And the song that the animals sing in the novel called The Beasts of England, and it's got a nice kind of beasts of England, beasts of Ireland, beasts of every land and clime. It's got a great like singable quality to it. It's supposed to really stand for some communist propaganda, songs that would have been written to make you really excited about being a communist, okay? So we're going to have more on those comparisons later. Well, so why have a revolution? Let's look at our notes. What are some reasons why? Well, revolutions happen when people are really dissatisfied with their current conditions, right? The king or the current ruler is doing a terrible job. He or she is ineffective, or even worse, they could actually be very dangerous and be harming people. So another leader comes along, like, for example, Karl Marx or Vladimir Lenin or Stalin, Joseph Stalin, and they offer promises about great improvements, and they even unite people under a common enemy. And sometimes it might even be an imagined enemy or a scapegoat. But they make these promises, people unite, and then they revolt against the government. And if they hope, they'll overturn the government and they'll enact their own government, right? But George Orwell, he was of the opinion that revolutions were absolutely pointless. Make sure that goes into your notes. It asks, what does Orwell think about revolutions? He feels they're pointless because he felt like the result ends up being, that you just trade one tyrant for another due to the corrupting nature of power. Now let's consider, what is this whole thing about power? Power is very seductive. When people have it, they want more of it. When they have it, they want to take it away from others that might potentially have it or that might take it away from them. You may stop the video at this point and ask yourself, what has power over you? Because let me let you in on a little secret. A lot of things have power over you and power over me. So think about it in your own home. Who or what has power over you? What about in school? Who or what has power over you? Principals, friends, right? We're talking parents at home, maybe. What about in your community? What has power over you? And how about our world? How about the universe? You could really take this out. Then let's stop and think about, if you were to act uncharacteristically, not be yourself, what might cause you to change your behaviors? Let's think about that for a second. What are some things that might change your behaviors? The need for you to acquire material items might make you change your behaviors. What about social acceptance? I suppose we could give the example that's the old standby that sometimes kids will drink, curse, smoke, diss somebody on social media, do whatever, just because they want other kids to think they're cool or to like them, right? That's a power that people have over you. So you have to be strong in your own power. But as I said, having power is very seductive. An Animal Farm, if you look at the last point on this slide, it is going to push the boundaries of what you think about power. And it's going to show how this old proverb is true, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Let's think about that. Absolute power Corrupt, absolutely. So what did George Orwell know about power? And if George Orwell believed that revolutions were pointless, what history did he know about that made him think that way? So let's first start with dictatorships. Well, he understood dictatorships. A dictatorship is a form of government. You'll find this on your notes. It's characterized by a single leader or a group of leaders, and they have little or no tolerance for other political parties or other points of view. He also understood what's called totalitarianism. That's a really fun word to say, totalitarianism. But it's a terrible form of government. It's a form of government in which one party has absolute control over all aspects of society. So put that in your notes. Here are some examples of dictatorships and totalitarian regimes. Now, those two words have been used interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same. But for the purposes of this lecture, let's just kind of think of them as being so similar. So you guys know now, I've said this man's name, Joseph Stalin. He was a dictator in the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler, of course, was a dictator in Nazi Germany. Benito Mussolini was a dictator in Italy. We have Mao Zedong, who was a leader under the People's Republic of China. And then the Kim dynasty, who it was, and even now the Kim leader is a dictator in North Korea. So more of the historical context you have to understand is that Orwell was disillusioned. I used that term in the last video about George Orwell. Disillusioned means you no longer have false illusions about something that you were hoping for. It's kind of faded away, and you might even feel very bitter inside and upset. So he no longer trusted in some of the things that society would promise, and he was disillusioned with totalitarianism and all types of tyranny. And he put this into his disillusionment, he put it into the form of an animal fable, okay, a story. It's also very anti-utopian. Now, utopian means things are very perfect. It's a place where people can live in peace and harmony. But this novel was influenced by, Orwell was influenced by Gulliver's Travels, written by Jonathan Swift way back in the 1700s. So it's a satire. It's anti-utopian. It's an animal fable. It's a political commentary. It's so much all packed into one. Now, some of his inspirations here were cartoons, other literary sources, the fables of Aesop, which you'll get to read, and the third and the fourth books of Gulliver's Travels. Now, I read Gulliver's Travels, the entire thing, in college, and my college professor was an expert in Gulliver's Travels. For those of you out there that I could tell you, shout out to Dr. Hawes. And I actually criticized I did a critical analysis on one of his literary works about Gulliver's Travels. So talk about being brave. I took on my own professor's works. So anyway, Animal Farm doesn't really attack openly the original ideals of revolution, but just the ways in which revolution happens and the ways that the promises are betrayed. You start off with great ideals, and suddenly people, through privileges and abuses, they kind of fade away. So the old regime or the old abuses are eventually restored in a systematic tyrannical form. And this is what Orwell means by totalitarianism, that each step violates some revolutionary principle of what will be, you'll learn, the 7 commandments that the animals created on the farm. They had these 7 commandments, kind of like, in the Bible, the 10 commandments. These are things that you should or should not do. So to get to where we need to understand our history of the Russian Revolution, Tsarist Russia was absolutely a massive country. It was immense geographically, and its economy was mostly agrarian. That means it was farmers. It was slow developing. There was very little industry. The people were extremely poor. They had to make their food last a very long time. The population in 1896, just a few years before the peasants revolted, was 92 million people, and they were diverse ethnically, Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, but again, they were mostly poor peasants who didn't own any land. Most of the land was owned by the wealthy, just a very few amount of people. And the poor were repressed. They weren't allowed religious freedom or artistic freedom, or to express themselves at all. So you had no civil rights. The poor were also exploited. That means used and abused. They forced children to work. People that worked on farms or even in any factories were forced to work very long, hard days for little to no pay. But the politics divided the people into several different groups. Now, we need to know some of these to get our novel, okay? You had your peasants, which eventually became socialist revolutionaries. They wanted the goods of society. Think about socialism that way. Then you have the proletariats, or the workers, okay? Then you had the autocrats, who controlled the government, and they were trying to keep their power along with the landowners, the nobility, and the higher clergy. You might remember that when we read the short story, The Most Dangerous Game, that there's an autocrat that he has fled to his own private island because he was forced to leave Russia. You guys remember that? Then you have the liberals. They want a socialist government. Then you have the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, who follow Marxism, not a lecture for today. And then you have the capitalists, who own land and factories, and they desire a monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy. So it'd be like having a king, but also having a parliament that makes decisions, okay? Now, this is a picture of the Romanov family, those who were in charge. The most important person being the guy in the middle. His name was Tsar Nicholas II, okay? And then his wife and his four daughters, and then his son. There's a close-up picture of Tsar Nicholas Romanov II. Now, a little bit about him. He was, of course, very wealthy, so he was privately educated. He was the last in a long, long line of Russian leaders, and he led an extremely exuberantly wealthy lifestyle. The children had their own horses. They lived in different palaces around the country. They spent much of their time with just their family and their ministers, but they were incredibly ineffectual leaders. They didn't really have any formal leadership training, and they didn't know, nor did they care to know, about this immense geographic region of Russia, the conditions of the poor, okay? So the Tsar was basically this puppet leader who had cabinet members that actually ran the country, controlled the government, but they did not do a good job. And anytime anyone spoke out against the failures of the government and the poverty, the Tsar would oppress and suppress the demonstrations. So the population before the revolution in 1905 was that they were very discontent. They were unhappy. There was a war, the Russian-Japanese War, and the Tsar wanted to show how powerful Russia was, but he underestimated the Japanese, and he even had a kind of a racist term about them, called them yellow monkeys. So when they fought, the Russians were inadequately supplied and trained, and the troops were suffering terribly heavy casualties. Along comes 1905. The peasants absolutely had it. The main reason was that they were literally starving, okay? They were rationed 4 ounces of bread daily. Years ago, when I used to teach this unit in another school in Petersburg, Illinois, I used to dress up like a Russian peasant woman, and I had a little thing over my head, and I had the 4 ounces of bread, and I would show, this is how much bread I get to eat daily. It's a small amount of bread. That's all they had to eat. The factory workers went on strike. There were violent demonstrations against the Tsar in the streets, but the Tsar sent out his military and shot them dead. But the people continued to revolt, and the Tsar was forced then to allow this creation of a parliamentary government, which is what some of them wanted. It was called the Duma. That does not last very long, by the way. But the important thing to note here is that even though the Duma is established and the people are getting somewhat of a voice at that time, the Tsar is still in power in 1905. Well, along comes World War I, and initially the Russian population supported the war, but I don't know how much you know about this war with Russians, but the troops, again, were inadequately supplied. And for example, for every 300 Russian bullets, the Germans had 3,000 bullets. So it was ridiculous in comparison, right? You couldn't even compare. The officers, the troops weren't trained properly. They suffered terrible casualties. Millions of Russians died in World War I. The population, of course, was upset about that. So another revolution comes, and this is 1917. Now, guys, this is the big one. When you hear about the Russian Revolution, this is it. It was called the February Revolution, but it really was November 7th. The population revolted. The factory workers united and went on strike. The military became insubordinate, and they refused to fire on their own people. That's when you see a unification of all of the regular people, right? That aren't autocrats and the rich and those still connected to the Tsar. So in the demonstrations, the people demanded, first of all, an end to the war. They wanted land for the peasants. They wanted food for the starving. Gee, that doesn't seem like too bad of a request, right? Better wages and power to the Soviets. And in the demonstrations, they force now the Tsar to abdicate and completely give up his throne. But this is where things get tricky and things take a terrible turn. The Tsar and his entire family, and that would be the Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorova of Hesse, okay, I can't say her name, their 4 daughters, and then their son and heir Alexei Tsarevich, the crown prince, their court physician, Dr. Botkin, a chambermaid, a cook, and their valet, they are held prisoner for 78 days in what looks in this picture like a palace, but it was really a wealthy merchant's home, and his last name was Apatiev, and they stayed at Apatiev's house or mansion, okay? They were imprisoned for 78 days. During that time, there were many who wanted them dead. So on July of 1918, the family was rushed in the middle of the night. Someone rushed in and told them they had to quickly get dressed and they had to leave and they had to escape the house. And that's because they were being told that they were going to be attacked. But guys, this was just a lie. And it was to get them all down into the basement of that mansion. And while they were down there, suddenly a dozen armed guards burst into the room and they gunned the entire family down. Now, the crazy thing is that because the women in their dresses, they were hiding diamonds and jewels, when the men were shooting them down, they couldn't kill them because the bullets couldn't penetrate their dresses. So it took 20 to 30 minutes to kill everybody. And then when the smoke cleared, if anybody was still breathing, they were stabbed to death. So this was a horrible horrific, chaotic murder scene. It was a small space, so imagine what that would be like. Now, the bodies of some of the dead were eventually found in a forest in 1991, and they were able to positively identify the bodies through DNA. But I'll bet you've heard of this. It turns out that the Crown Prince Alexei and also one of the Romanov daughters, Anastasia, they were not accounted for. So that fueled speculation and this legend that Anastasia, the youngest daughter, actually survived the execution. But it turns out that in the United States, a woman came forward and claimed that she was Anastasia. But after she died, they did DNA testing, and she was just a Polish woman. She was not at all Anastasia. So that is where we'll end this portion of the video. We are now going to get into the workers uniting and the Russian communist forces taking over the country. So I'll see you in our next video, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that horrible, tragic story.